Sweatshop is a pejorative term for a workplace that has harsh, poor working conditions. The work may be difficult, dangerous or underpaid. Workers in sweatshops may work long hours with low pay. Regardless of laws mandating overtime pay or a minimum wage, child labor laws may also be violated. History. A sweatshop is a factory or workshop, especially in the clothing industry, where manual workers are employed at very low wages for long hours and under poor conditions. Many workplaces through history have been crowded, low-paying and without job security, but the concept of a sweatshop originated between 1830 and 1850 as a specific type of workshop in which a certain type of middleman, the sweater, directed others in garment-making under arduous conditions. The terms sweater for the middleman and sweat system for the process of subcontracting piecework were used in early critiques like Charles Kingsley's Cheap Clothes and Nasty, written in 1850, which described conditions in London, England. The workplace is created for the sweating system, a system of subcontracting in the tailoring trade were called sweatshops and might contain only a few workers or as many as 100 and more. Between 1850 and 1900, sweatshops attracted the rural poor to rapidly growing cities, and attracted immigrants to places such as London and New York City's garment district, located near the tenements of New York's Lower East Side. These sweatshops incurred criticism. Labor leaders cited them as crowded, poorly ventilated, and prone to fires and rat infestations. In many cases, there were many workers crowded into small tenement rooms. In the 1890s, a group calling itself the National Anti-Sweating League was formed in Melbourne, Australia and campaigned successfully for a minimum wage via trade boards. A group with the same name campaigned from 1906 in the UK, resulting in the Trade Boards Act 1909. In 1910, the International Ladies' Garment Workers Union was founded to try to improve the condition of these workers. Criticism of garment sweatshops became a major force behind workplace safety regulation and labor laws, as some journalists strove to change working conditions. The term sweatshop came to refer to a broader set of workplaces whose conditions were considered inferior. In the United States, investigative journalists, known as muckrakers, wrote exposés of business practices, and progressive politicians campaigned for new laws. Notable exposés of sweatshop conditions include Jacob Ree's photo documentary How the Other Half Lives and Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, about the meatpacking industry. In 1911, negative public perceptions of sweatshops were galvanized by the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City. The pivotal role of this time and place is chronicled at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, part of the Lower East Side Tenement National Historic Site. While trade unions, minimum wage laws, fire safety codes, and labor laws have made sweatshops rarer in the developed world, they did not eliminate them, and the term has come to be increasingly associated with factories in the developing world. In a report issued in 1994, the United States Government Accountability Office found that there were still thousands of sweatshops in the United States. Using a definition of a sweatshop as any employer that violates more than one federal or state labor law governing minimum wage and overtime, child labor, industrial homework, occupational safety and health, workers' compensation, or industry registration. This recent definition eliminates any historical distinction about the role of a middleman or the items produced, and focuses on the legal standards of developed country workplaces, an area of controversy between supporters of outsourcing production to the Third World and the anti-sweatshop movement is whether such standards can or should be applied to the workplaces of the developing world. Sweatshops are also sometimes implicated in human trafficking when workers have been tricked into starting work without informed consent, or when workers are kept at work through debt bondage or mental duress. all of which are more likely if the workforce is drawn from children or the uneducated rural poor, because they often exist in places without effective workplace safety or environmental laws. Sweatshops sometimes injure their workers or the environment at greater rates than would be acceptable in developed countries. Sometimes penal labor facilities are grouped under the sweatshop label. Sweatshops' conditions resemble prison labor in many cases, especially from a common-found Western perspective. Sweatshops in question carry characteristics such as compulsory pregnancy tests for female laborers and terrorization from supervisors into submission. Workers then go into a state of forced labor. If even one day of work is not accounted for, most are immediately fired. These working conditions have been the source of suicidal unrest within factories in the past. Chinese sweatshops known to have increased numbers of suicidal employees have suicide nets covering the whole site in place to stop overworked and stressed employees leaping to their deaths. Sweatshops have proved a difficult issue to resolve because their roots lie in the conceptual foundations of the world economy. Developing countries like India, China, Vietnam, Bangladesh and Honduras encourage the outsourcing of work from the developed world to factories within their borders in order to provide employment for their people and profits for their employers. Outsourced work can at times bring some form of wealth to impoverished countries where people struggle to provide for their families. Regardless of Western labor concerns, low wages are preferred to none at all in these areas. The shift of production to developing countries is part of globalization, but may also be described as neoliberal globalization to emphasize the role that free market economics plays in outsourcing. Anti-sweatshop movement. Some of the earliest sweatshop critics were found in the 19th century abolitionist movement that had originally coalesced in opposition to chattel slavery, and many abolitionists saw similarities between slavery and sweatshop work. As slavery was successively outlawed in industrial countries between 1794 and 1865, some abolitionists sought to broaden the anti-slavery consensus to include other forms of harsh labor, including sweatshops. As it happened, the first significant law to address sweatshops was passed in the United Kingdom at the same time that the slave trade and ownership of slaves were made illegal. Ultimately, the abolitionist movement split apart. Some advocates focused on working conditions and found common cause with trade unions and Marxists and socialist political groups, or progressive movement and the muckrakers. Others focused on the continued slave trade and involuntary servitude in the colonial world. For those groups that remained focused on slavery, sweatshops became one of the primary objects of controversy. Workplaces across multiple sectors of the economy were categorized as sweatshops. However, there were fundamental philosophical disagreements about what constituted slavery. Unable to agree on the status of sweatshops, the abolitionists working with the League of Nations and the United Nations ultimately backed away from efforts to define slavery, and focused instead on a common precursor of slavery, human trafficking. Those focused on working conditions included Friedrich Engels, whose book The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844 would inspire the Marxist movement named for his collaborator, Karl Marx. In the United Kingdom, the Factory Act was revised 6 further times between 1844 and 1878 to help improve the condition of workers by limiting work hours and the use of child labor. The formation of the International Labour Organization in 1919 under the League of Nations and then the United Nations sought to address the plight of workers the world over. Concern over working conditions is described by muckraker journalists during the Progressive Era in the United States saw the passage of new workers' rights laws and ultimately resulted in the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. passed during the New Deal. On February 4, 1997, Mayor Ed Boyle of North Olmsted, Ohio introduced the first piece of legislation actually prohibiting the government of purchasing, renting, or taking on consignment any and all goods made under sweatshop conditions, and including in the definition those goods made by political prisoners. This was then quickly copied and passed by other American governments such as Detroit, New York, and San Francisco. Later, Mayor Boyle introduced the legislation to the Mayors and Managers Association, where it was immediately passed, and he was invited by President Clinton to address a panel studying the subject in Washington, D.C. Mayor Boyle always gave full credit for the idea to his wife Nancy Vladowski. He also said that it was important that the legislation started in a middle-class suburban community, since it demonstrated that all Americans, regardless of fantasy divisions, believed their neighbors should be loved and protected regardless of political and geographic distinctions.